السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله بنعمته تتم الصالحات. All praise is due to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, with whose bounty we're able to complete all good deeds. Uh, Alhamdulillah, you guys are still with us, listening to all of the sessions. Um, and this is the final and the last installment of the 8-part series on Islamic history. Really, we've covered some details and intricacies, culture, art, politics, you name it, that you probably won't find collected all together anywhere else. So alhamdulillah, that's a testament to the community that we have, that we're able to engage at this level. What we have here is a picture of one of the most elegant and most lavish palaces that exists on the earth. Those that have visited Turkey probably recognize it. It's right on the Bosphorus. And as you can see, the style is very much Baroque, very much French, very European influenced. And then juxtaposed against that is a quote from Sultan Osman when he was speaking to his son Orhan. He said, "Son, be careful about the religious issues before all other duties. The religious precepts build a strong state." Now, keep in mind the Islamic state that the Ottomans had established was not an ethnocentric state. It was not based on allegiance. It was not a nation state. It was based on, some people would say based on conquest, but most of us would say it was based on some early form of pan-Islamism, that there is an idea of a Khalifa, or that there should be a Muslim polity in which a person would be able to travel from Morocco all the way to India continuously without reaching any borders and without having to answer to anyone, and theoretically would be able to speak only one or two languages and to traverse all that distance and communicate easily and seamlessly with all of the population there. So, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So, our agenda here is to discuss the Atlantic slave trade and Islam in the United States, the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, and what that means in terms of colonization, the Nakba in Palestine, the catastrophe, some renewal movements, and I use the word renewal intentionally. We're going to talk about what does tajdeed mean, and the post-colonial period, especially in Africa and in India. Does anybody recognize the masjid that's there on the right? This is located in Harlem, New York City. Yes, with the dome on the top. This is the masjid established by Malik Shabazz, by Malcolm X. And this is located on Malcolm X Boulevard in Harlem. And so this goes back to the 1960s. Of course, if you wanted, you can go in Harlem and you can find the Nation of Islam Temple, and that dates, I think, back to the 1930s or 40s, the interwar period, somewhere there. So it's much older. Okay, Bismillah. So here is an example of a Muslim scholar from West Africa that was enslaved, and we can see from his diaries and journals that he was able to recite. In fact, it's not this person, but there's another individual who was able to dictate the entire Quran, was able to write out the entire Quran from his memory, because even having a copy of the Quran was something that was quite rare, and was able to handwrite the entire copy of the Quran. Um, this is, I think, Yusuf Yaro, right? Something like that. The photo that's there in the center is somebody that we should know because he was here in Georgetown, in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., and he was a Muslim that, because of his great intelligence, was able to become free, and was a Muslim scholar, and wrote several books. So let's talk a little bit about what it meant, this process of the Atlantic slave trade. Initially, there was no intention of creating an international trade system for slaves. The plan that the Europeans had, particularly the Portuguese and the Spanish, was that they would enslave the Native American people. That did not work out. The main reason it did not work out is because, lo and behold, they started dying. And if they, so some people they say that it was intentional, but it definitely was not intentional because they wanted to use them as slaves. But what ended up happening was that they were exposed to European diseases, and they died by the millions in the early decades of the 1500s. Closer to here in the US, we see that in Mexico, especially, that the vast majority of the population died as a result of these diseases. I think upwards of 80% of the population, depending on the area. And what the European colonizers decided to do is to purchase slaves by appearing in West African ports looking to buy in huge quantities, right? And so you see the entire West Coast was initially the locations where that trade took place. And initially they dealt with local African kings. And what they would do is they would capture other fellow Africans, but from opposing tribes or from opposing groups, and that they were in war with, and they would sell them. What this did is it created a very destructive cycle because the slaves were generated by warfare. And so when they sold the slaves, they would end up with more money. What did they do with the money? They bought more weapons. So it's just like oil and weapons, right? So at that time, instead of oil, petrol, the cycle with the arms industry was with slaves. And so what ended up happening is it decimated the population in West Africa. Later on, it affected sub-Saharan and Central Africa. And as a result, 15 to 20 million were enslaved to the Americas. And out of the United States, 3 to 6 million were believed to be Muslim. These are the ones that arrived. Right? So keep in mind that about 1/3 didn't make it across the journey. So that means that there were millions that were Muslim that did not make it all the way. All right. So we have some photos, some lithographs, and some illustrations of what that looked like. Now, there were many who were engaged in a process of preserving their Islam. We talked about the process of handwriting the Quran, but the way that slavery was practiced in America was very different from the way that it was practiced in Africa and in the Middle East. Not to say that it was okay or that it was acceptable. Sheikh Ahmed al-Timbukti, for example, I've mentioned before, the great scholar of Mali, he wrote a very extensive book, treatise, on the ethical implications of slavery and whether it's permissible in Islam. This is one of the reference points. So, of course, nowadays everybody's like, oh, slavery is so bad. But it also makes us wonder that how come all of these hundreds of years, where was everybody? How come it didn't upset anyone? And where were the scholars when they saw the abuses? Now, part of that story is that the abuses in the Muslim world, although they existed, were far less than they were in the New World. In the New World, there was complete freedom. It was unfettered to beat and to abuse, and in many cases, even to kill slaves, because they were viewed as property, right? Whereas in Muslim lands, people viewed it as property, but there was not the same process of dehumanization. So the two were kind of seen as coextensive, right? So the idea of being able to break and to pray 5 times a day, no, that was not possible. In the 1800s in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, there was a high demand from Muslim slaves for Arabic Qurans. And you can imagine, as a slave, how long would you have to save your money? What type of extra work would you have to do in order to save money to get a handwritten or a printed copy of the Quran that had to travel all the way from Europe, because Europe was printing Qurans, and come all the way to Brazil? And in their ledgers, it shows that they were importing Qurans because there was such a demand. Brazil had the highest percentage, by the way, of Muslims out of all of the countries. But what ended up happening is slave owners resented that because the Muslim population tended to be more educated, and the slaves in general tended to be more educated than even the slave owners. This is one of the crazy things about slavery. And in 1835, there was a revolt that created a fear of Muslims. So that affected your marketability. If you were Muslim, you were less desirable as a slave. Among Brazilians, to the extent that there are reports that many of the slaves were sent back for being Muslim because they were afraid that they had a stronger willpower and they had a greater tendency to revolt compared to those that did not have a strong religious identity. Okay. Now, fast forward all the way to the early 1900s after World War One. There's a photo there of Elijah Muhammad. This is a conference. Anybody see the individual in the bottom left? You got to recognize him, of course. Muhammad Ali, who else, right? And so this is a photo from the conference of the Nation of Islam. At the time that the Nation of Islam appeared, there were Muslims, by the way, in America, particularly in the Midwest, but it was completely an unknown religion, right? Nobody knew about Islam or Muslims at that time. Um, Now, what they did is they revived that memory of Islam, particularly among the previously enslaved people. And Elijah Muhammad kind of formed a new religion that you can say is 60 or 70% Islam, and a lot of other ideas and principles that are borrowed from Christianity and from his own ideas. But one of the taglines is "Do for Self." It was based on Black empowerment, the advancement of African Americans who, under the rubric of Christianity, felt that they had to accept an inferiority, a system in which they were second class citizens and that they were seen as having less dignity and less importance. Of course, in our Islamic tradition, we have lots to say about that. That the fact of since content of melanin is not determinant of anything, right? Because these are just a few genes that are turned on and off, and the reality of the person, has nothing to do that. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said there's no superiority of a black over a white or a white over a black, and then all the other complexions as well. However, in the 1960s Malcolm X, he performed the Hajj thanks to assistance from the Egyptian embassy here in Washington. Um, and the Imam in downtown Manhattan arranged the trip for him. And as part of that trip, he also visited some of the African countries. He made a special trip to Palestine and he visited Gaza. When he came back, he started delivering a series of lectures over the course of 1 year and promoting Sunni Orthodox Islam the way that we practice Islam. But beyond that, he preached that Islam offered a solution to America's race problem, right? Now, of course, he was killed as a result of that. So we regard him as a shaheed. And it's a very sad story. We know the story as those documents have been declassified. I think it was in the late 90s that the FBI declassified the documents. The government was not involved directly in killing him, according to what we know, but the group Nation of Islam individuals wanted retaliation against him, and the government was aware of the plot and they facilitated it and allowed it to happen because they wanted him to be killed. Um, so this is not a conspiracy theory. These are based on the documents that are publicly available. In addition to that, oh, definitely, yes, and I strongly recommend. Although the book is written by Alex Haley, it's based on the interviews of Malcolm X, and I would strongly recommend anyone that has not read the book to look into it. It's very thought provoking. Um, Especially since the race problem in America, it never goes away. Racism is very entrenched in this society. Um, and in addition, W.D. Muhammad is a very important person. Uh, I've often said this, no one's corrected me, so I'm going to assume it's true, that the day that W.D. Muhammad became a Sunni Orthodox Muslim was the greatest number of shahadas in one day, because he made a unilateral decision based on his conviction that the path of his father, which is very hard for a person to do, W.D. Muhammad is primarily famous because of who his father is, although he is a person of his own merit, right? But he's known because he's the son of Elijah Muhammad. So it's very hard to go against your own family and your own legacy. But he did so, and he slowly shifted his community, transitioned them into the fold of mainstream Islam. They still have their own masajid, W.D. Muhammad, but they're practicing Islam the same way that we practice Islam, although within some separate communities. And so that was a very momentous occasion that took place, I think, in the 1980s. And that's when 90s? It could be. It started in the 80s. I think it started in the 80s. It may have completed in the 90s, but I'm pretty sure it was in the 80s. Yeah. It's hard to pin a date down because what ended up happening is even the Nation of Islam today is closer to Islam. I mean, Louis Farrakhan is his own special case, right? We put Farrakhan aside, the people that I know that follow the Nation of Islam, they're still a little bit closer to Islam than the original form of the Nation of Islam. So it's something evolving. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's go back in time to the mercantile system. The mercantile, this is taking us back to social studies growing up. There is a common belief among Muslims that the reason that Europe got ahead was because of the Industrial Revolution. As you know, the Industrial Revolution was because of factories, because of steam power, because of mills and the use of hydropower. And so many Muslims believe that Europe got ahead economically because of that. However, that's not true. The Industrial Revolution happened later. The main source of European advancement in the beginning was stealing things. And this is what's recorded in history, which is that the Spanish, the Portuguese, the British, and the French started to colonize, particularly in Southeast Asia, coastal areas of India, North Africa, and of course, the first that they really targeted was Central and South America. And in the case of Central and South America, they returned back with boats filled with silver and a little bit of gold. They were very disappointed, right? Cortez was like intent on finding gold, but they did come back with a lot of jewels and a lot of precious metals. What did this do to the international economy? Believe it or not, the world had already been very globalized. As a result, the Ottoman currency lost a lot of value and inflation was at a very high rate. And you're like, how's that possible? There's a gold standard. But because they have the dinar and the dirham, right? Those aren't the words that they're using. They have the gold and silver. If you suddenly have a greater supply of currency, so then the money that you do have is going to lose value. At the same time, they don't have any new conquests. There's a stagnation of tax revenue, and Europe is surging ahead. This caused the Ottoman economy to weaken and to become dependent in Europe. And at the same time, rather than becoming more open minded, the Ottoman society became growingly anti intellectual. It became more closed off. There was less investments in learning and in culture. So all of that is happening simultaneously. Then militarily, they had a huge battle with the Holy League, that's Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia. And it was a terrible defeat for the Ottomans, decisive victory for Europe. That's in 1699. As a result, the Ottomans were forced to enter into the Treaty of Karlowitz. That is guess who the dragons are in the illustration? This is a drawing from the time. Look at how the Muslims are depicted and how the Christians are depicted in the painting, right? And then in the middle, we have a photo from the Caucasus region. This is actually from Crimea, right? So that's in Ukraine today, which was part of the Ottoman territory. And that was all lost around the same period that they lost Greece, Serbia. Russia, of course, is invading and attacking from the other side. Although the Ottomans did receive some support from England and the rest of Europe because they're worried about Russia. And to the right, you have a depiction of Greece. Now, it seems unusual. Anybody that's been to Greece? Anybody been there? Okay, a few of you. Have you ever seen anything like that in Greece? There's something very unusual in that photo. There's a minaret. I've been to Greece. I've never seen a minaret in Greece, right? That is because they destroyed all the masjids, right? So a lot of these former Ottoman territories, they were vassal states, and because of these battles in trying to get independence, it fought a lot of resentment against Islam and against Turks, right? So the animosity between Greeks and Turks, for example, is very famous, right? Okay, as a result of this weakness of the Ottomans, they are forced to many capitulations in which they have to give in to Europe. There's a short interlude in which there's a tulip period, in which there's a kind of rapprochement between Europe and the Ottomans. But after that, the Ottomans are retreating. They have to give away huge parts of their economy and their society, and particularly the French were very good at this. They carved up special trading privileges in which they would not have to pay taxes and everybody else had to pay taxes. And then they took control and jurisdiction over their own citizens. Then over time, no, we want jurisdiction also over all Catholics. Then later they said, no, we want control over anyone that we choose to put under our jurisdiction. Now, what did the French do? They discriminated against Muslims. So they gave preference to Christians, especially Christian traders. And it's bizarre. In a huge empire, the biggest empire in the world, which is majority Muslim now, Muslims are second-class citizens. Okay? So that's why later on, when they get carved up and colonized, it doesn't feel that strange, because that's how it's been for a while. And they had to do this, and the reason they did it was because otherwise they would lose their territory. They would have gotten partitioned by Austria and Russia. So in a way, you could say that the French swooped in and saved them. It really depends on how you look at it. Right? All of that is true. This is another beautiful palace that built by the Ottomans. Sultan Abdul Majid I, he's the one that constructed it. Very bad money management. Okay, this is how most empires fail. They run out of money. Same thing like countries, right? What's the problem happening in Pakistan? They own $7 billion that they need to pay in the next 5 years to the IMF. They're negotiating another $1.6 billion with the IMF because otherwise they're not solvent. So this is how great countries and great civilizations fail. They spend too much and nobody pays attention. That's what happened to the Ottomans. He spent a lot of money on the Crimean War and also on all of these palaces. In order to fund that, right, it's not like today, you don't have fiat currencies, right? The currencies are precious metal. So what they needed to do is they needed to obtain foreign loans at very, very high interest rates. Later on, Mahmud II, who came right after him, he reorganizes the governments, he creates ministries. All this time, right? All these hundreds of years, the Ottomans are operating the same way that the caliphs did. That Umar and Uthman, they have the Khalifa, they have the Wazir, and they have their governors. And they've been operating. They didn't have distinct ministries. They didn't have a clear civil service. Um, uh, and, uh, uh, and so because of that disorganization, it caused a lot of issues. The Janissaries, remember the private army that they had, they were eradicated, and as a result, they didn't take it so well. There was a very awkward battle in the streets of Istanbul, and they called this Nizami Jadid, that means like the new Nizam, the new order, right? And the French language began to be taught alongside with Turkish. So Arabic starts to get lost, Persian starts to get lost, Turkish, of course, is still emphasized, and French becomes an unofficial language of the Ottoman Empire. And they bring in expert consultants, of course, that are mostly from Germany. Okay, the Ottomans don't even realize that this is happening because they are so aloof. But there's a new organization called Young Ottomans, and they believed that the reforms that were happening were not enough. right? So the Ottomans, they do realize that they need to change. They start to promote secular, scientific education. The education system is reformed. You start to see that the religious schools start to disappear. This is the obsession that we find in Muslim majority countries about engineering and being a doctor. It all comes down to this time period because they're trying to play catch up with Europe, and they think that going into those fields is going to make that happen. They also promote the idea of Ottomanism. It's promoted, but nobody cares. Like, what does it mean? Like, I'm Ottoman. Like, people understand I'm Muslim or I'm come from this background, but they weren't sold on that idea. So as a result, Sultan Abdul Aziz is deposed in 1876. He wasn't particularly effective to begin with, but he was advancing the Tanzimat reforms, right? That began with the previous Sultan Mahmud II, but it wasn't fast enough for the young Ottomans. So he's removed. Sultan Abdul Hamid's brother is installed as the Sultan, but he was also incompetent. And so then Sultan Abdul Hamid II becomes the Sultan. In my view, everybody has a bias, right? In my view, Sultan Abdul Hamid II is one of the best sultans of the Ottomans, but it didn't make any difference because he was way too late. The damage was already done. He traveled to Europe when he was young. He was part of diplomatic delegations. He was very well educated. He was a very cultured person. He was a poet, a wrestler. He made his own furniture. He didn't go to any of the lavish palaces, but rather one of the remote palaces. But unfortunately, they were not successful in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. There's a TV show about Abdul Hamid. They have a photo from there. That's the actor. That's not the real one. Um, and so as a result, he declared bankruptcy in 1875, and a big part of the budget is just debt service. On the top, we see a steam train. Anybody know where that's from? This is the Hijaz Railway. They created a train system between Medina to Damascus. And ultimately, it was supposed to connect from Damascus to Istanbul, which would create a loop between Istanbul and Medina. Um, Part of this is the idea that he would claim to be the Muslim Khalifa. Now, if you're very cynical, if you believe that he's like this very pious person, you'll be like, oh, he's like defending the Muslims from the Europeans. If you're very cynical, you'll come to a different conclusion, that he's using religion and he's using the title in order to keep everything together, right? So he's promoting pan-Islamism. He's promoting the idea of a sultanate. Why did that not work before? In the old Ottoman Empire, they did not emphasize that this is an Islamic empire. Any ideas? Why did they not say that? That this is the Muslim Khalifa? Sometimes. But they normally didn't say that though. We didn't get to Ataturk yet. Yeah. But this is how we think about it. But if we go back in time, only two of the Ottoman sultans called themselves Khalifa. And there's like 400 years between them. Because the majority of the people under the Ottomans are not Muslim. Over 50%. If you consider in Palestine, if you consider in the Caucasus, if you consider Poland and Hungary and Austria and Greece and even Anatolia, even Turkey, not everybody is Muslim. The majority of the Ottoman citizens in its history were not Muslim. It's only after the Ottomans lost all of that territory, for the first time, at the very tail end of the Ottoman Empire, is the majority of the people Muslim. So they didn't emphasize the Islamic character, because what would that do to the non-Muslims? It would only alienate them. Is there anything to be gained by saying, oh, you're in a Muslim, empire? Right? So they didn't emphasize the Islamic nature. Yes, it's in the flag and it's part of the identity, it's part of the legal system, but they didn't emphasize that part of being the caliph. On the bottom, you see the Ottoman troops preparing to defend Palestine, right? They're there in front of Al Masjid Al Aqsa. Of course, they weren't able to do it very successfully later on because the empire fell apart. This is a picture from Medina. This is the Hijaz railway station in Al Medina. There's a park that's right in front of it now. It's very nice. It's also a museum, and I would encourage everybody to check it out if you're able to go when you go for Umrah. It's just a very quick Uber ride from the center of Medina. They laid railways everywhere. They sent delegations to sub-Saharan Africa. They sponsored universities, including an Islamic university in Beijing. So it looks like Sultan Abdul Hamid is doing a lot. But at that point, the Ottomans are already very, very weak. So is it really going to make a difference? Uh, Proponents of the Ottomans, they also make another point. They say that he was offered by Theodor Herzl. Does anybody know who that is? He is the founder of the Zionist movement. And so what he does is he offers to pay, and he has the support of, I think, Rothschild, I'm assuming, and many other very wealthy individuals to purchase land through a transaction with the Ottomans and to pay down the debts of the Ottoman Empire. And Sultan Abdul Hamid, he refuses to do so. Now, others, of course, would critique, and they said, well, they didn't prevent people from settling. It's a complicated issue, right? German military advisors were brought in. They purchased naval ships from England and from France. Education system expanded. In 1895, there were more than 1 million students in the public education system. The literacy rate within the Ottoman lands, it increased very much. But of course, all of this happened in Europe when? After the Renaissance, right? This happened in Europe in the 1600s and the 1700s, right? That the literacy rate started to go up. In the Muslim world, it's happening way, way later, right? And so everything that happened in Europe previously, it's happening in the Muslim world, but at a whole different time span. Now, what is happening, you're getting modernization, but it's without secularism. And this is going to connect with what Brother Abdul Ilah mentioned about Ataturk, which we'll get to in a moment, which is modernization with secularism, right? So there's two different modes. Now, speaking of Ataturk, which is his title, it means father of the Turks, there's an organization that comes up, which is called the Young Turks, okay? And this is a depiction of it, right? This is not an actual event. This is meant to be symbolic, right? You see the chains, and I'm assuming that means freedom. Sultan Abdul Hamid is there. In 1909, he is deposed by the secret society known as the Young Turks. Now, they are supported by Christians within the Middle East, particularly Christian Arab nationalists at the time. This is the same thing that we mentioned when in Saudi Arabia, there were people that supported Ibn Saud and supported the Wahhabis, and that was because they needed to be rallied by saying, well, they're not following the right Islam. Because there's something about Muslims that they didn't want to fight other Muslims. And so similarly, a lot of the Ottoman sentiment came from either secularists or from Christians within the Ottoman lands. Because the Muslims, even the ones that hated the Ottomans, were kind of on the fence. They're like, I don't know about this fighting other Muslims thing. Right? If he's the caliph, I better not mess with him. I'll leave him alone. So suddenly we see that after 33 sultans, and one of the most successful, the most successful Islamic administrations you can think of, the Ottomans come to an end. Technically, there's another 14 years, 2 more sultans, but they're puppets, they have no authority. And now the Muslim world is in crisis because there's no Khalifa. You have World War I, in which the Ottomans joined Turkey. Meanwhile, they're having back and forth warfare with the Armenians. Now there's a lot of ethnic conflict. Why is the ethnic conflict happening? And you didn't have that ethnic conflict before. Of course, the Ottomans, they fought the Armenians and others and Greeks, but those were wars of conquest. Those were defensive wars or offensive wars. They were not ethnic conflicts. But as soon as the nation state is the way that people start to see their identity, then you see a great precipitous rise in ethnic conflict. They joined with the Germany, which was the dumbest decision ever, because Germany was already losing by the time that the Ottomans joined. That was around 1914, I think, that they jumped in. In 1915, the British, they were in contact with Sharif Hussein, and the British, of course, there's always backroom dealing with the British. They he's the governor of Mecca, and they fund him and encourage him to create an Arab revolt. They promise arms and gold and support, weapons, and he does so and sweeps up the whole western side of the Arabian Peninsula. They take Medina, they take Amman, they take Damascus. Jerusalem falls into non Muslim hands under the British for the first time since the Crusades. Now, it's already sad for Jerusalem to be occupied, but guess who invited them? We did. Okay? This is the part of Islamic history that nobody wants to own up to, which is that colonization in the central area of the Muslim empire was by invitation. Okay, it's not like Algeria, right? It's not like India, right? Those are other examples, but in the so-called heartlands of Islam, they were asked to be there because the Arab nationalists, they thought and they believed that they had a deal with the British and the French. But of course, we know that's never really going to happen. This is the agreement that we're talking about. They never had any intention of allowing Muslims to self rule. At the same time, they have secret negotiation with French allies to determine what the Middle East would look like afterwards. Part of that is the Balfour Declaration that was issued in 1917 that was sent to Baron Rothschild with a promise to support a national home for the Jewish people located in Palestine. Now, keep in mind that Jews did live in Palestine, right? But in the year 70 of the Christian era. So 70 years after, roughly the time of Prophet Isa, alayhi salam, they were expelled. They were not expelled by the Muslims, they were expelled by the Romans. By and large, most of them never returned. Okay? And that's why there was a Jewish diaspora throughout the world, North Africa, Europe, and this is mostly the fault of the Romans. Okay? So it has nothing to do with Muslims. There's no Muslims around to begin with. Okay? And Anatolia is occupied as a result of that as well. This is a photo of Mustafa Kemal, who's known as Ataturk. He was an army officer that served in World War I. He was very successful as an army officer, and they successfully expelled the occupation between the years of 1919 and 1922. So to be fair, we should give him some credit, along with the other military generals, in preventing Turkey from being occupied by foreigners. What they did is they created a new state. They called it Turkey, and they believe part of the ideology was that the Ottomans were weak because they mixed with Arabs, with Persians, and they did not create a strong Turkish identity. They said, we need to go back to our roots. What did they do? They banned the hijab, they banned the fez hat that was so ubiquitous. They closed Sufi orders, they outlawed Sharia law. They created a new civil code to replace that. They banned the adhan, although that happened a little bit later. And most importantly, they instituted language reform. So previously, the Turkish, old Ottoman language was written in the Persian alphabet, which is almost the same as Arabic, which is basically Arabic alphabet. And they switched to the Latin alphabet. Now, when you change the alphabet, you are now creating a barrier because now you're not able to access all that prior knowledge and information. And hopefully I'm not here to offend or upset anyone, but we have to, talk about what happened. In my view, it led to oppression of minority populations, Greeks, Arabs, Kurds, and Armenians. Maybe it was unintentional, but that was the result. Because they were affirming a Turkish identity, so the minorities were no longer welcome. right? They were pushed out. And around the same time, the Armenian genocide takes place. And then following that, there's a war of independence. Now, to be fair to Kemal Ataturk, he was not even anywhere near Armenia at the time, right? So he's not accused of being involved in that. Of course, many Turkish historians would take umbrage with that characterization. They would say that there was a relocation of Armenians, and as a result, there were many people who died, and that was unintentional. Um, but because there's an aspect of cleansing the population and removing the Armenians to another location, and because it was done in the way that it was done, this is why many people characterize it as a genocide. And we're not worried about words, right? It's just a matter of kind of what happened. There's an interwar occupation between World War I and World War II. Sharif Hussein and his children are given, they're supposed to be given Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, but they're only able to hold onto Jordan. The current king is a descendant of Sharif Hussein, which is different from the King Hussein. Right? Those are two different people. The Iraq's borders are designed in such a way that they wanted the Kurds that are Sunni to be 1/3, then the Arabs to be 1/3 that are Sunni, and the Shi'is to be 1/3. In reality, the Shi'is are more than 1/3 in Iraq. And if you exclude the Kurds, then of course they're the majority. Lebanon is this made up country where they just kind of, it's a mountain, but they call it Lebanon. It has no natural borders. But the French are obsessed with Lebanon. I don't get it. Remember when they had that, not the earthquake, they had that explosion, and then Macron came to Beirut and they welcome him like he's like long lost father, right? And so the French have always, I mean, Beirut is such a beautiful city, right? It's considered the Paris of the Middle East, and they've always been interested in it. And the reason that they love it is because they always dreamed that Lebanon would be a Christian country. But of course, it's far from that. You have Sunnis, you have Shi'is, and you have Christians. And that has caused a lot of religious conflict. Most of that religious conflict because of the French. And that's because they promoted the Christians and demoted the Muslims. In Iraq, the conflict between Sunnis and Shias is also mostly the fault of the British because they put Sunnis in charge of the government when the majority of the Arab population was Shia. Right? There's a lot more detail that I'm omitting, but that's the short version. In 1918, you have to say a little bit about Palestine. There are about 60,000 Jews in the new borders of Palestine. This is an important statistic because you're gonna encounter people who say, well, Jews have just the same rights to the state of Israel. They have a right to exist, but you cannot lie about the statistics. Nobody denies this. There are only 60,000 Jewish people in Palestine in 1918. They are a tiny fraction of the population at a time in which no one was preventing them from living in Palestine. They could have easily come. And so during the interwar period, because of European pogroms, right? So because of anti-Semitism in Europe becoming violent, a lot of them left Europe and came to Palestine. In 1939, the population has swelled to 460,000 at the beginning of World War II. Then during World War II, there are Jewish people that flee Nazi persecution. It probably increases roughly by another million. And then in 1948, the British end their mandate. The Jewish population is large enough to form a country. The British planned this from the very beginning. Okay? This is not an accident. It's not because of Zionist militias. No, it was always the plan that these militias would take over and that there would be a Jewish state and they would declare independence and Europe would recognize it, okay? It's not a conspiracy theory. These are the facts. And then from 1948 until 49, over 750,000 forced refugees. I just realized before I said 1 million, I meant to say 500,000, not 1 million people that came into Israel in the early years. Over 750 that are forced refugees. This is known as a Nakba. The Palestinian population is much more than that, but that's because in the initial phase, it's not, it's less than half of the area of Palestine that has been declared part of Israel. And we'll look at a map. Before we go there, we have a photo from Iraq of Sunnis and Shias praying. In fact, Sunnis and Shias historically in Iraq have gotten along very well. It's only because of colonization that they had issues. To the left is one of the Arab freedom fighters, anti-Ottoman tanks. To the right, the movie Lawrence of Arabia that talks about the war against the Ottomans that was funded by the British. And on the bottom, we have ships arriving from Europe in I think in Jaffa, in the port of today known as Haifa, which is occupied Palestine, Israel. This is a map showing in 1947. The green is all of the area of the Palestinians. The white are the occupied territories by these terrorist organizations that are armed, and they create these militias that take over and steal land from the Palestinians, although they're telling Europe that, well, we're living in these kibbutzes, and these kibbutz are in the middle of the desert that nobody wants, so unclaimed land, but that's far from the reality. Then there's the UN plan, that's the next one, in which the UN countries, because of lobbying from Europe and from America, they draw up a plan saying that, well, there's going to be Palestine and there's going to be Israel, it's some kind of partition. But what ends up happening is every time there's a war, Israel uses it as an opportunity to expand its territory. So in 1949, the Arab countries surrounding it, they attack. Israel wins. It's kind of pathetic because you have like 6 Arab countries and just this tiny brand new country, and I don't know, and they couldn't do anything. The 6-Day War came after. The 6-Day War is in 1967, and that was a much more serious effort. That was a more concerted effort, but it was not successful. Then in 1973, then the Egyptian army, they launched an operation on the 6th of October, which is a partial victory. And so as a result, there's a peace treaty between Jordan and Egypt, and that has led to the third map, which you have the West Bank and the Gaza Strip that we know. There are more UN resolutions on Palestine than on any other subject. Okay, so for us, we say, well, Israel doesn't have a right to exist, but legally, according to the UN resolutions, Israel has a right to exist in the white portions. And according to international law, Palestinians have the right to militarily defend themselves in the green portions. Not to go into Israel and to attack, but they do have the right under international law to an armed struggle within the green portions. Now, on the far right, no, the third one. Yeah, the UN plan never actually happened, right? So this is something theoretical. The third one is international law. I mean, that's how it's supposed to be, based on all of the peace treaties. The third one is reality. See what they've done because of the settlements, and this is also outdated, right? It's actually worse than this. Because of the settlements in the West Bank, it's become like Swiss cheese, right? And the reason that they've done this has been mostly because of the policies. As you know, this is Benjamin Netanyahu's second time as prime minister. He was previously there in the 90s, and then there was a more conciliatory One Israel coalition led by Ehud Barak that wanted to make peace, or they said they wanted to make peace with the Palestinians. And so he has made it his life's vision to make sure that there is never a Palestinian state. And so this is the result. A little bit about West Africa and India. The French, they easily took West Africa because they had been weakened so much by the slave trade that we talked about. This is a photo of Sheikh Ahmadou Bamba, one of the greatest scholars in modern history. He was a religious leader in Senegal. He's the founder of the Mouridiyya. He led a non-violent struggle against the French. He produced a lot of beautiful books and poetry on meditation and interpretation of the Quran. And he's known because he prayed the 2 units of prayer in the governor's office. And he showed his intention to be subjected to Allah alone. They ended up, they didn't harm him because they knew that people would flip out. So what they did is they exiled him. And so he continued to teach, and there was never anything formal. We have a picture here on the top left. Anybody know that diamond? The Kohinoor, right? The very famous crown jewels that were stolen from India, although they argue that it was purchased, right, or it was given as a gift, right? I mean, I don't know what the real story is, but you end up with these small kingdoms throughout India. In 1740, the British, they offer to provide support and troops in order to get trading privileges, which they get. They say, oh, we'll give you tax advisors, we'll give you tax collectors, right? We're here to help you. And so what ended up happening is the British step by step take over the government, and they make these kingdoms dependent on them. Because of the capitulations, just like the Ottomans gave capitulations, same thing is happening in India. The local merchants can't compete. They have these monopolies. And there's another religious factor, which is that the British viewed Muslims suspiciously because they thought that Muslims were more likely to revolt against them. And so as a result, they cultivated relationships mostly with Hindus as opposed to Muslims. This is one of the reasons why in India that Muslims are economically in a worse position compared to Hindus. It goes back to the 1700s. This is another movie, right, that shows the Sepoy Revolution, rebellion. There were Indian soldiers. It started in Bengal, that were serving in the company army, and there was a mutiny in 1857. What ended up happening is that they discovered that the gunpowder, so you have these cartridges that you have to pull open with your teeth in order to load the musket. It wasn't a musket, it's a rifle. And it was greased with pig and cow fat. And so when troops found out about that, they started a mutiny, and they used this as a pretext in order to take over the government. They took over land and they ruled India directly under the crown, right? So the queen, or was it a king then? It's a king, yeah, yeah. So the king at the time, we're so used to having a queen in England, right? The king ended up getting rid of the East India Company, right? And taking over and ruling under the crown directly. Guess who was blamed for the revolt? For the revolt, Muslims were blamed, right? It's, oh, you can't trust these Muslims, right? And so as a result, the social status of Muslims decreased, but it was mostly political, because the British, they don't really care about who's Hindu and who's Muslim. They just want to make sure that they stay in power. And so by making Muslims second-class citizens, it helped them politically. And then at around the same time, they got rid of the Mughal Empire, because the people that did the mutiny went to the Mughal Empire and they wanted them to be, at least their figurehead. There's, of course, a crisis in the partition. The Indian National Congress, they wanted to push for more political power, but the Muslims are nervous because the Hindus are the majority. What's it going to look like? And meanwhile, there's a Pakistan movement. Originally, Muhammad Iqbal wrote some poetry about that. Then Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he wants to carry out that vision. Gandhi is actually not in support of having a Muslim state, because he said we'll be stronger if we're together. But what ended up happening is once it was set in motion, it was inevitable. On the top, you see the trains leaving for people frantically. They're leaving their land and property. Below that, of course, the ruler of Kashmir wants to be independent. He's like, we don't want to be in either country. Then, Pakistan makes a move, then India makes a move, and you end up with the big mess that we have today. And on the bottom is from the TV show Miss Marvel, right? So this is a new show, which is very interesting because they incorporated the trauma from the partition into the story of this girl, teenager that's a superhero. So I threw in a photo there of that as well. Now, shortly thereafter, because the Muslim majority areas, you have four on the left. You have Balochistan, you have Sindh, you have Punjab, and the Northwest province, which was not a province at the time, but now it is. So let's say the four. And then to the east, you have East Pakistan. So East Pakistan is less than half of Bengal, but this is the majority. These are all the Muslim majority areas. Now, what ends up happening is there's a big population difference. Even though you have four provinces on the left, you only have one on the east the population in Bangladesh, which is East Pakistan, is greater than West Pakistan. So when there's an election, guess which candidate is successful, right? So Mujibur Rahman is successful, but guess what? The Pakistani army refuses to allow him to take the office. And so as a result, there is a revolution. There's a movement, there's strikes that take place, especially in the capital city of Dhaka. And so as a result, the army from Pakistan mobilizes from the west to the east. And in the beginning, they target their operations on Hindus in Bangladesh. But later on, it affects the entire population. According to the most accurate statistics, more than 1 million people die. The reason I'm mentioning that is because this is a very ugly phase in Muslim history, because we have never seen Muslims kill other Muslims at that scale. I can hardly think of another example in history. And the reason I think this happened is because this is not something that the Pakistani public wanted. In fact, the Pakistani public didn't know that this is happening. But this is because this decision was left up to the army. And so these army countries that are led by the army, they're not answerable to anyone. And so this is what ends up happening. Okay. Meanwhile, we're getting to the end here. In North Africa, there's a special relationship with the United States. Morocco is the first country that opens up trade and its ports to America. There's a treaty of peace and friendship in 1786. After hundreds of years, the French are obsessed with reaching Algiers. Remember Barbarossa? The Ottomans, for hundreds of years, are defending Algeria from the French. But when the Ottomans become weak, then the French are successful and they take that over. If you're interested in the story, I talk about it in the khutbah. There's a photo to the right of Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, al-Amir. And so I talk about that in the Friday khutbah. It's been recorded. On the top, we have Umar Mukhtar from Libya fighting the Italians. And on the bottom, we have one of my favorite movies, Casablanca. Has anybody seen that? It's such a lovely movie, which it doesn't have to do with any of this history, but it has to do with the period during World War II and what it looked like being in those colonial countries of North Africa at that time. The French, they made it French Algeria. There's nothing like this in human history. They said, we're extending our country, and they said this is part of France itself. Hundreds of thousands of French people moved in. They dominated the local economy, and the same thing that happened in the Ottoman lands, the same thing that happened in India, the Algerians became second-class citizens in their own country. Same story. And then the same thing similarly happened to Tunisia, but nothing in North Africa is as bad as what happened in Algeria. Similarly, in East Africa, the British, they go for the whole land, coming from Cairo, coming from Egypt and Sudan. They want to go all the way down to South Africa. There's a great Zanzibar empire. It's a maritime empire. And the British, they defeat them in 40 minutes because they have no chance against the British, and they cause them to split into 2 states. So the question that we're left with is, where does the Ummah go from here? You know, the Europeans, they said that this was white man's burden, that these people are uncivilized and we have to come in and save them from themselves. But the borders that they drew are completely arbitrary. I mean, literally the border of Jordan was made by a ruler and a pencil. This is a historical fact, that it goes right through towns and villages. I mean, this is how they made borders. And by World War I, the majority of Muslims around the world were under foreign occupation. For a lot of Muslims, especially the ulama, they viewed success as proof of Islam's truth. And they viewed failure as a sign of God's wrath. They're like, well, we're failing because we did something wrong, because we're bad people. I don't know if I'm convinced of that, but this is how a lot of people feel. They viewed the Crusaders, the Mongols, as a temporary setback. Then you have these 3 great empires. You have the Safavids, you have the Mughals, you have the Ottomans. So the Ummah redeemed itself after this great, great weakness but we've never recovered from colonization, and that's because we have been intellectually colonized. Now we suffer from an inferiority complex, and so it's not just financial, it's something much greater than that. So, what does it mean for Europe to be successful? On the top, we have a picture of the Rohingya as they're trying to enter into Bangladesh as refugees. On the bottom is a picture from Xinjiang for the Uyghur Muslims that are being persecuted by the Chinese. So, everywhere it seems that Muslims are suffering, and the Prophet ﷺ, he promised us that Allah will raise every hundreds of year man yujaddid laha dinaha, that who will revive the religion, who will renovate the religion. So it's the same message, but who will bring it back. This is a picture in Germany of the masjid in Cologne. And some people say, let go of the past. Forget this obsession and nostalgia that we need to bring back the good old days, right? Make Islam great again. Let go of that and instead think about the future. And so that's why to conclude, I gave a list of some of the great thinkers, like Imam Shamil. He was one of the resistance fighters against the Russian. Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, similar. Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida. These are the reformers that wanted to modernize Sharia. Great scholars, Said Nursi, who wrote the Risale-i-Nur, and also revived Islam in Turkey. Ahmad Reza, the Brelvis and the Deobandis. Of course, they fight all the time, but they were great revivers and great scholars at the time. Muhammad Ilyas, that started the Tablighi movement. A personal favorite of mine, Shah Waliullah Dihlawi, one of the great muhaddiths of all history from India. Shaykh Abul Hassan Ali Nadvi as well. These are some of the great scholars from India that unified all of the Muslims together. They tried to bridge the gap between those that were leaning towards more Salafi thinking, more Sufi thinking, those that wanted to modernize, those that wanted to be more traditional. And they found a way of synthesizing all of that in a way that I think is very authentic. Abul Ala Maududi, who is the founder of another movement to modernize Islam, Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Ikhwan movement, Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, who passed away a few years ago, who initially was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, but then distanced himself from that. And he's famous because he has written a lot of the contemporary fatwa that we know of today. Sheikh al-Buti, who I used to attend his classes, he's in the middle photo there. On the top, you have Murabit al-Hajj, the great scholar from Mauritania. Also, you have Sheikh Didu from Mauritania. Abdullah bin Baz is the former Grand Mufti of Saudi Arabia, one of the great Salafi thinkers. I don't agree with most of his ideas, but extremely knowledgeable. Nasruddin Albani, the great muhaddith of modern times. Also, I don't agree with all of his views, but very brilliant. And he revived the science of hadith in the modern times. And on the very bottom is Habib Umar, one of the great scholars of Yemen, who is bin Alawi Sufi, but he promotes a version of Sufism that is very much in conformity with the Quran and the Sunnah. So these are some of the modern thinkers. We end with a quote from Said Nursi that abandoning politics prevented me from reducing the Quran's diamond-like truths to pieces of glass under the accusation of exploiting them for political ends. So the question I leave you with is that, is it actually more liberating to not have Islamic politics? Because now we can just explore the truths of Islam without it having to spill over, without religion being manipulated for political ends. We tend to think of it as a negative, but there is a positive side to it as well. Okay. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. Thank you all for your patience. If there are any questions, we don't have too much time, but we can try our best, inshallah. And we have the Zoom open as well. If anybody would like to ask a question. Any thoughts? Yes.
Imam Refai, this is Mohsin here. I don't know whether you can hear me.
Okay.
Okay, it looks like he stepped out. But so you were mentioning that the Armenian oppression and the genocides that took place started out through the nationalism aspect of it. I've heard a different aspect to that, where one of the big problems that occurred was that one of the reasons Russia wanted to invade and take over the Ottoman Empire is because they considered themselves the inheritors of the Orthodox Christian world, and they wanted to reestablish their like the home base in Constantinople. And there was this constant feeling that the Armenians, being Orthodox Christians, were going to be disloyal to the Ottoman Empire.
I gave the shorter version. And you know, and there's even more involved in that, because you have the Armenians, you have Georgia, you have so many smaller countries located within there, and the Russians, starting with around the time of like Ivan the Terrible, um, Catherine, the 1600s, 1700s, they started to have this obsession with like moving westward and to shift into the Caucasus region. And so that was a fear. I hadn't heard that they wanted to go to Constantinople, but I mean, it makes sense that they would want to reestablish that. So he's muted now. Yeah. If he wants to speak, I can just put the microphone here and we can hear. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, go ahead. Yes.
And now, after abolishing the Khalifa, now you see so many groups appearing to claim the ownership of Islam. And then, of course, we saw the rise of some movement. I mean, from Pakistan or from and to the Arab world. And then also there's the European. I mean,
Like the Hizb
American
ut-Tahrir movement.
authorities where they
Yeah.
try to now we have to find a way how to control these Muslim countries. And then you have the creation of Saudi Arabia, the brotherhoods, you know, and then it's becoming like Islam is being used more than to control
This is a big subject, you know. Dr. Tariq and I have spoken extensively about it, but you know, we can only offer our personal opinions. You know, I'm not a big fan of Islamic parties and the Islamic political movements, because I haven't found, I mean, if I lived in these countries, would I even want to vote for these Islamic parties? They're usually ridiculous. You know, you get the huge clowns are the ones that are running for them, you know, because uh, they think they don't need to deliver on results, and to work on behalf of the population, because they're using religion. It's like, you have to go with me because I'm going to save the religion. um, and so I think if you have a genuinely authentic society, and we see this in Southeast Asia, we see that in Indonesia and Malaysia, not that they're like, you know, this is the poster child for what Islam should look like, but they don't have that kind of politics, because the majority of people are Muslim and they have Muslim laws, Islamic laws there, but they tend to be a lot more liberal than what is found in the Middle East. And that's because that's the way that they practice Islam. It's authentic to the society that they're a part of. And so I personally think that if you have uh, a society that's defined by Islam, then the government will automatically take on an Islamic character. And it doesn't need to be forced the way that, you know, some people think, like we have to make it an Islamic government. Because when you make it an Islamic government, it has more potential to be abused. So we should be cautious about going for that. Mhm. Wa alaikum salam.
I think it would be beneficial if maybe we could spend a minute or two comparing and contrasting the nation state model versus the pre-modern nation state model, because I mean, you mentioned like Pakistan, right? And how it's essentially like like a garrison state for the army, just like interfering in politics all the time, which is not to the same extent, I would argue anyways, pre-modern nation states. I mean, yeah, the military would, do their thing, but there was a respect to the symbolic authority, I guess that is, whoever the sultan or whatnot.
So for the first part, it's really hard because so much harm has been done by trying to create the idea of the nation state. you know it's similar, like even like in Egypt and Sudan. Where does Egypt begin, where does Sudan end? I mean, these two countries are linked to each other. Similarly, like what makes a person Moroccan, what makes a person Algerian, what about Amazigh, how do they fit into that? What makes a person Turkish? How many people in Turkey are actually Greek blood, right? But you can't talk about that openly. What about Kurds, where do they fit in? Kurdish country. So as soon as you start talking about the nation state, it causes displacement. And the worst kind of nation state is the one that I think is defined by, having like a religious theocracy. Personally, I think that one of the worst episodes in history is the partition. If India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan were all one country, those would be the majority today. Right? So by splitting it up in this great country, by splitting it up, it created a religious conflict because they're set on opposite sides. It caused the conflict in Kashmir, and it created all this Islamophobia that we're seeing play out in India today. So that is because of the nation, because that concept was foreign to Muslims. We didn't have that concept. It happened in Europe after the Hundred Years' War. Then they had in 1648, they had a peace treaty, the Peace of Westphalia. And so for them it worked because that's what their society looked like. That's not what Muslim looked like. We had mixing of cultures, mixing of ideas. That's what made our societies rich. When we had to create these fake borders and fake lines, it made us weaker. So that's why I think that we need to remove that also from our thinking, that nation state, because we've been tricked into thinking that that's the Eurocentric way of looking at the whole world. And to be civilized, we have to fit into that paradigm. Yeah. In terms of I wasn't sure about the second part about like Pakistan and a garrison state.
Well, because the reason Pakistan is a garrison state in that way is because of the hyper-nationalism within these borders, right? So the Pakistani military kind of views it as like its base, basically, right?
Yeah.
Whereas if it was a pre-modern nation state, they're not really focusing on creating this one territory as their military base. It's more about expansion, right? So the dynamics are much different.
Yeah, and I think part of that is that when you create a nation state with a that's militarized, then their raison d'être is that like we have to save you from the enemy. They always need an enemy, otherwise nobody's gonna care about them. So, alhamdulillah. Yeah, it's true. That's true. Well, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to unite us. If we can be united in borders, at least we should be united in the heart. May Allah heal all those that are sick and forgive all of those who passed away, especially our brothers and sisters. As you know, more than 100 people, maybe 200 people died yesterday, actually today in Gaza, waiting for flour. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgive them and elevate their status and raise them into Al-Jannah, make their graves gardens from the gardens of Jannah. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil